There is something almost paradoxical about Frank Martin when we first meet him in Transporter 3. He is the kind of man who seems to have eliminated uncertainty from his life. Every movement is measured, every decision has a purpose, every professional boundary is clearly defined. He does not need to know the names of the people involved. He does not need to know the emotional history behind a delivery. He does not ask unnecessary questions. He simply takes the job, follows his rules, and gets the package where it needs to go. Frank has turned professionalism into a kind of armor. But Transporter 3 begins by asking what happens when that armor is taken away from him. Not metaphorically. Literally. A device is strapped to his wrist, a distance is imposed on his movements, and suddenly the man who built his entire identity around controlling every variable discovers that someone else has already calculated his next move. His car can no longer simply be a vehicle. His body can no longer simply be his own. Even the space around him has become a trap. And that is what makes the third Transporter movie more interesting than its reputation might suggest. Beneath the speeding Audi, the explosions, the increasingly elaborate fights, and the familiar Jason Statham intensity is a story about control. Frank believes his rules make him free, but the film keeps finding ways to turn those same rules into chains. His first rule tells him never to change the deal. His second tells him never to ask for names. His third tells him never to open the package. Those rules once protected Frank from complications. They kept his work clean and his conscience compartmentalized. But Transporter 3 places a living person inside that compartment. Valentina is not merely something Frank has been hired to move. She talks. She argues. She jokes. She provokes him. She notices him. And the more time they spend together, the harder it becomes for Frank to pretend that the human being sitting beside him is simply another piece of cargo. The explosive bracelet makes that contradiction physical. Frank is transporting someone, but he is also being transported by the circumstances. He appears to be driving toward a destination, yet the real journey is happening inside him. What happens when the man who controls every situation loses control of himself? That question quietly sits underneath almost every major sequence in the movie. Frank's reputation has always been based on competence. He can drive through impossible situations, disarm opponents, improvise weapons, read a room, and remain almost unnaturally calm while everyone around him is panicking. But competence has become his substitute for intimacy. If he can solve every problem mechanically, he never has to confront the problems that cannot be solved mechanically. He never has to explain himself. He never has to depend on anyone. He never has to admit that another person might matter to him. Transporter 3 therefore does something unusual with an action hero who had previously been defined largely by his emotional distance. Instead of making Frank stronger, the film repeatedly makes him more vulnerable. It gives him fewer choices. It puts him in situations where his physical abilities are not enough. And then it gives him Valentina, someone whose personality refuses to fit neatly into the system he has created for himself. The result is still a pulpy action thriller, sometimes gloriously exaggerated and sometimes unmistakably trapped inside the conventions of its era, but underneath that surface is a surprisingly coherent character idea. Frank's greatest enemy is not simply the criminal organization chasing him. It is the belief that freedom means never allowing anyone else to have influence over him. To understand why that matters, it helps to remember what the Transporter franchise had become by this point. The first film introduced Frank Martin as a mysterious professional who lived according to strict rules. The appeal was immediate because the character was almost a fantasy of perfect competence. He was disciplined without being boring, violent without seeming bloodthirsty, stylish without becoming flamboyant, and mysterious without requiring a complicated mythology. The second film expanded the spectacle and pushed the action further into outrageous territory. By the time Transporter 3 arrived, audiences already knew what kind of experience they were buying. They expected Jason Statham in a black suit. They expected a powerful European car. They expected roads, pursuers, explosions, fights, and Frank performing some solution that would appear impossible to everyone except him. The challenge was that the character's greatest strength was also the franchise's biggest limitation. Frank is designed not to reveal too much. He is supposed to be controlled. He does not volunteer his emotions. He does not build relationships easily. He is not the kind of protagonist who spends 10 minutes explaining his childhood before making a dramatic decision. That means a conventional character arc is difficult to construct around him. If the filmmakers wanted the third movie to feel like more than another delivery assignment, they had to introduce something capable of breaking through the wall around him. Valentina becomes that force. She is deliberately inconvenient. She does not behave like the silent passenger an action movie might normally give its hero. She talks when Frank wants silence. She asks questions when he wants distance. She makes jokes when the situation should be terrifying. She refuses to remain an object. That refusal becomes essential because the movie's entire plot depends on people being treated as objects. The criminal scheme is built around transportation, logistics, leverage, and exploitation. People become assets. Cargo becomes currency. Environmental destruction becomes another business calculation. Frank's professionalism is therefore placed uncomfortably close to the villain's worldview. Frank and the criminals are obviously not morally equivalent, but both operate inside systems where people can become transactions. The difference is that Frank eventually recognizes the person inside the transaction. That is the movement that gives the story its emotional shape. And this is why the opening portion of the film deserves more attention than it usually receives. The story begins by establishing that refusal has consequences. A transporter named Daniel becomes caught in a situation where a dangerous assignment is no longer something he can simply decline without cost. The sequence establishes the larger mechanism before Frank himself fully enters it. Someone is already manipulating the rules of the world. Someone is already demonstrating that a professional's freedom can be removed by force. By the time the pressure reaches Frank, the audience understands the basic principle. This is not a normal contract. It is a contract designed to make refusal almost impossible. Frank's ordinary life depends on choice. He chooses the jobs he accepts, the terms under which he accepts them, and the boundaries he will not cross. But the criminals behind this operation understand that the easiest way to control a man who values rules is to create a situation where obeying the rules becomes the only way to survive. That is why the bracelet works so well as a narrative device. It is absurd on one level, because this is an action movie operating on heightened genre logic. But symbolically it is almost perfect. Frank has always been bound by invisible rules. Now those invisible rules have become visible. The bracelet gives physical form to the psychological restrictions he has spent years placing around himself. The 25-mile limitation is particularly important. Frank is a man who is constantly moving, yet his freedom is suddenly measured by distance. He can drive anywhere, but only within a specific radius. He can choose how to fight, but he cannot choose where the fight takes place. He can protect himself, but he cannot simply abandon the passenger because abandoning her means abandoning his own chance to survive. The road, traditionally the ultimate symbol of freedom in American and European action cinema, becomes a boundary. Frank is moving constantly, but he is not free. That contradiction follows him through almost the entire film. Frank's isolated lifestyle makes the situation even more revealing. He has built a world where predictability is valuable because unpredictability usually comes from other people. His routines are clean. His possessions are controlled. His clothing is functional and precise. Even his car feels less like a luxury object than a carefully maintained extension of his own body. The Audi is powerful, elegant, responsive, and engineered. So is Frank. The car does not complain. It does not ask personal questions. It responds to input. It allows him to translate thought into movement almost instantly. When Frank is behind the wheel, the world becomes something he can calculate. Road, speed, distance, obstacles, angles. These are variables. People are harder. People lie. People change. People become attached. People create obligations. That is why Valentina is such a disruptive presence. She introduces the one variable Frank cannot solve through technical expertise. She is unpredictable because she is human. At first, Frank treats her like a complication. He wants the simplest possible interpretation of the job: move the passenger, survive the pursuit, finish the delivery. But Valentina refuses to cooperate with that interpretation. Her humor becomes a form of resistance. Her curiosity becomes a challenge. Her emotional directness exposes the fact that Frank's silence is not necessarily evidence of confidence. Sometimes silence is simply avoidance. The more she pushes, the more the audience begins to see small fractures in Frank's controlled exterior. He becomes irritated. He becomes protective. He becomes curious about her. He begins making decisions that are difficult to explain through professional obligation alone. Those changes are subtle because Frank is not suddenly transformed into a completely different person. That would actually weaken the character. His development works precisely because it happens through behavior. He does not give a speech announcing that he has changed. He simply starts choosing differently. The journey also allows the movie to combine several genres without completely abandoning its action identity. It is a kidnapping thriller, a road movie, a crime conspiracy, an action showcase, and an unconventional romance. The road structure gives the story a natural rhythm because every location becomes another stage in the struggle for control. Frank and Valentina cannot simply stay in one place. They must move. Pursuers must move. Information moves. Dangerous material moves. Criminal interests move across borders. The entire plot is therefore organized around transportation, which makes the title more meaningful than it first appears. Transportation is not merely Frank's occupation. It is the movie's basic metaphor. Everything is being moved from one place to another, including Frank himself. The criminals want to move cargo. Frank wants to move Valentina. Valentina wants to understand Frank. Frank gradually wants to move from professional detachment toward personal responsibility. The physical movement mirrors the emotional movement. The farther the car travels, the harder it becomes for Frank to remain psychologically where he started. When Frank first becomes aware of the explosive device and the distance restriction, his instinct is to understand the system. This is what professionals do. They identify rules, identify weaknesses, identify consequences, and search for loopholes. The problem is that the people controlling him have designed the situation specifically around his psychology. Frank's greatest advantage is his ability to remain rational under pressure. So the criminals create pressure that makes rational calculation increasingly difficult. The bracelet punishes distance. The mission punishes refusal. The passenger creates emotional complications. Pursuers force constant movement. Every time Frank thinks he has solved one problem, another variable appears. And yet the film does not portray him as helpless. Quite the opposite. This is where Statham's physical performance becomes crucial. Frank's competence is communicated through economy. He rarely wastes movement. His fights are not designed to look like elaborate martial arts performances where every strike is decorative. His body behaves like a tool. He grabs, redirects, strikes, uses leverage, and turns ordinary objects into weapons. The choreography is often exaggerated, but the character logic remains consistent. Frank is not interested in looking impressive. He is interested in ending the problem. That difference gives his violence its distinctive personality. The same principle applies to the driving sequences. The car is not merely moving quickly because the movie needs spectacle. Frank drives with the same mentality with which he fights. He reads the environment. He calculates openings. He uses obstacles. He turns the road itself into a weapon. A pursuing vehicle is not simply an enemy, it is another physical object whose momentum can be manipulated. A barrier is not simply something blocking the road, it is a potential advantage. A narrow space can become a trap. A sudden change in direction can create separation. The film frequently cuts between Frank's face, the steering wheel, pedals, tires, gears, surrounding vehicles, and the road ahead. These edits create the sensation that his mind and the machine are operating as one system. The result can become excessive, especially when the physics begin stretching beyond plausibility, but the underlying filmmaking idea is clear. Frank does not merely drive the Audi. He thinks through it. The vehicle becomes his most reliable partner because, unlike human beings, it obeys. Then there is Valentina, sitting beside him and refusing to behave like machinery. Her presence changes the rhythm of the film. Whenever she enters a scene, the emotional texture becomes less predictable. She is sarcastic, playful, sometimes irritating, sometimes vulnerable, and often far more emotionally direct than Frank. The contrast is obvious, but it is not simply a setup for romantic comedy. Valentina represents a different philosophy of existence. Frank survives by limiting exposure. Valentina seems willing to experience things. Frank controls information. Valentina asks questions. Frank sees a dangerous situation and thinks about the most efficient solution. Valentina can still find absurdity inside it. That difference creates friction, but it also creates intimacy. They are trapped together, and forced proximity has a way of revealing personality. In a normal relationship, people can choose when to leave. Here, Frank cannot simply walk away without consequences. He has to remain beside her. He has to listen. He has to respond. The journey therefore removes the physical distance that normally protects him from emotional contact. At first, this feels like a burden. Then it becomes a source of motivation. Frank begins to protect Valentina not because the contract requires it, but because he recognizes her vulnerability. That distinction is central. A professional can protect a package because the package has value. A person protects another person because that person's life matters independently of the transaction. The film does not always articulate that difference with sophistication, but it dramatizes it through Frank's choices. As the pursuit intensifies, he increasingly acts as though Valentina's survival is an end in itself. That is a meaningful violation of his normal philosophy. His job is supposed to be about completing a delivery without asking unnecessary questions. But the more he learns about the operation, the less morally neutral the job becomes. Dangerous industrial material is involved. The conspiracy extends beyond a simple kidnapping. Environmental consequences are attached to the criminal plan. The people behind it are willing to manipulate governments, businesses, and individuals for profit and power. Suddenly the question is no longer whether Frank can complete the contract. The question is whether completing it would make him part of the machine he despises. That is where the movie's environmental storyline becomes more important than it initially appears. The criminal operation treats pollution and human life as logistical problems. Dangerous material can be transported because someone can make money from moving it. The damage is distant from the people making the decisions. That distance is important. Exploitation often works by separating action from consequence. Someone moves the material. Someone else suffers the contamination. Someone signs the contract. Someone else loses control of their life. Johnson operates through precisely this kind of distance. He does not need to stand beside every victim. He creates systems that make other people perform the violence for him. Frank, by contrast, operates at close range. He sees the people affected by the decisions. He sees Valentina. He sees the attackers. He experiences the physical consequences himself. His proximity to the consequences gradually makes neutrality harder. Johnson therefore functions as more than a conventional villain. He is Frank's thematic opposite. Both men value control, but they understand control differently. Frank's control is self-discipline. Johnson's is domination. Frank controls himself so he can remain independent. Johnson controls others so they cannot become independent. Frank's rules are restrictions he voluntarily accepts. Johnson's rules are restrictions imposed through fear. The explosive bracelets make that distinction visible. Frank has always lived by rules, but he chose them. Johnson takes that psychological structure and weaponizes it. He essentially tells Frank that if he wants to survive, he must obey. The villain understands that physical force is not always necessary when a person's behavior can be engineered through consequences. This is why Johnson can remain distant for so much of the story. His power comes from the system, not from personal physical dominance. Frank, meanwhile, is strongest when the system breaks down because improvisation is his natural language. The action sequences gradually become expressions of that conflict. Every fight asks whether Frank can regain control of a situation that has been designed to control him. The attackers may have greater numbers, weapons, or positional advantages, but Frank possesses something they often lack: adaptability. His fighting style is essentially a philosophy of improvisation. He takes what is available and makes it useful. A weapon can be turned against its owner. A piece of equipment can become a defensive tool. The environment can alter the balance. The famous bicycle-related action sequence is memorable not simply because of its physical absurdity, but because it captures the character perfectly. Frank is surrounded by limitations, yet instead of accepting the environment as fixed, he finds another way to move through it. He does not fight according to the opponent's expectations. He changes the terms of the encounter. That is exactly what he eventually needs to do psychologically as well. This is also why the film's geography matters. Roads, bridges, industrial sites, open fields, towns, and enclosed spaces are not interchangeable backgrounds. They determine what Frank can and cannot do. In open territory, movement creates possibilities. In enclosed spaces, movement becomes restricted. Industrial environments feel especially appropriate for the villain's world because they are built around machinery, containers, logistics, and human labor reduced to function. Frank fits visually into that world because he too is initially defined by function. He is the transporter. He has a role. He performs it. But Valentina keeps forcing the movie to ask what happens when a human being refuses to remain inside a functional category. She is the package that cannot remain a package. The midpoint of the story becomes increasingly personal for exactly this reason. Frank's original strategy is essentially to survive long enough to finish the job or escape the situation. But information changes the meaning of survival. Once he understands more about the criminal operation, completing the delivery becomes morally dangerous. He cannot simply say that the consequences are not his concern. That would be easy if he had never met Valentina. It would be easier if he had not witnessed the consequences around him. It would be easier if the person beside him were silent cargo. Instead, he has become involved. His professional code is being tested by his own humanity. This is the point where the movie quietly changes its definition of the mission. Frank is no longer just transporting Valentina. He is protecting her. The difference sounds small, but psychologically it is enormous. Transportation implies distance. Protection implies responsibility. One is a service. The other is a relationship. Frank's emotional development is therefore visible through the ways he begins violating his own rules. He asks questions. He becomes invested. He responds to Valentina's personality instead of ignoring it. He reveals pieces of himself. He becomes willing to risk his professional objective for a human outcome. None of this makes him suddenly sentimental. That would be inconsistent with the character. Instead, the film allows Statham to communicate change through small shifts in behavior. His face remains controlled, but his attention changes. His priorities change. His reactions become less purely tactical. He still drives. He still fights. He still wears the suit. He still operates with frightening efficiency. But the reason behind those actions becomes different. That is the film's smartest character decision. Frank does not need to stop being Frank in order to grow. He needs to discover that being Frank does not require emotional isolation. The relationship with Valentina is therefore both the film's greatest opportunity and one of its biggest weaknesses. The idea is strong. The execution is uneven. Their chemistry depends heavily on contrast, and that contrast can be entertaining. Valentina's humor prevents the film from becoming relentlessly grim. Her unpredictability makes Frank uncomfortable in ways that no armed opponent can. A gunman can be defeated. A car can be outrun. A human being asking Frank an uncomfortable question is harder to neutralize. But the romance sometimes develops faster than the screenplay has time to justify. The audience can understand why Frank becomes attached to her because they spend so much time together under extreme circumstances, but the emotional progression is still accelerated by the demands of the genre. This creates a tonal tension. On one side is the brutal action thriller, full of explosions and physical danger. On the other is a developing romantic relationship that occasionally feels as though it belongs to a lighter movie. Yet even when the romance is imperfect, its thematic purpose remains useful. Valentina is there to make Frank experience something he cannot calculate. Inspector Tarconi reinforces that idea from another direction. Tarconi is one of the few people who can interact with Frank without treating him as a myth. He provides continuity with the wider world of the franchise and reminds us that Frank is not completely isolated by circumstance. He has connections. He simply prefers not to make those connections central to his life. Tarconi's presence also adds humor and humanity without destroying Frank's mystique. Where Johnson represents people using systems to control others, Tarconi represents a relationship based more on familiarity and trust. He knows Frank's personality. He understands his habits. He can challenge him without needing to dominate him. That contrast matters because the movie is ultimately interested in the difference between influence and control. Not every person who changes Frank is controlling him. Sometimes another person changes us simply by making us care. Malcolm's role is more functional, helping push the plot into motion, while the various henchmen serve as physical tests. Each opponent gives Frank another opportunity to demonstrate how he solves problems. Their personalities may not always be especially deep, but their physical differences help vary the action. Some confront him through direct force. Others use weapons or vehicles. Others attempt to exploit the environment. The best of these sequences make the fights feel like extensions of Frank's intelligence rather than random interruptions between story scenes. When the action becomes repetitive, however, the formula becomes obvious. Frank is chased, Frank escapes, Frank fights, Frank continues. This repetition is one of the film's clearest structural limitations. The audience knows Frank is exceptionally difficult to stop, so suspense cannot always come from the question of whether he will win a fight. It has to come from what winning will cost him. The bracelet creates some of that tension because physical victory does not automatically create freedom. Frank can defeat 10 men and still remain trapped inside the larger system. That is an important distinction between physical power and actual agency. Frank is almost absurdly powerful physically, but the movie repeatedly reminds us that physical strength cannot solve every form of control. He can break through a barrier, but he cannot simply break the rules of the bracelet. He can defeat an attacker, but he cannot punch a criminal conspiracy out of existence. He can drive faster, but speed alone does not determine where he is allowed to go. The story therefore creates an interesting imbalance. The more powerful Frank appears physically, the more trapped he becomes psychologically. That contradiction gives the action sequences a thematic function. They are not merely demonstrations of what Frank can do. They demonstrate the limits of what he can do. The climax ultimately brings Frank into direct conflict with the system that has controlled him. By this point, the mission has transformed. The original objective has become secondary to survival, protection, and moral responsibility. Frank's final strategy depends on reclaiming movement. The man who spent the entire movie being told where he could and could not go must eventually determine his own direction. This is why the road metaphor becomes strongest near the end. The car has always represented Frank's independence. The road has always represented possibility. But throughout the movie, those symbols are corrupted by restriction. The Audi can move, but Frank cannot freely choose its destination. The road is open, but the bracelet defines a boundary. The journey is constant, but the destination belongs to someone else. Reclaiming the vehicle and reclaiming his choices therefore become almost the same action. Frank's confrontation with Johnson also works because the two men finally meet as representatives of opposing philosophies. Johnson believes control is strongest when other people perform it for you. Frank believes control comes from mastering yourself. Johnson creates fear and dependence. Frank creates distance and discipline. The irony is that Frank's philosophy has its own vulnerability. His extreme independence means that he can be isolated. If he refuses attachment, there is less for an enemy to threaten. That sounds like strength, but it also means he has built a life with fewer reasons to fight for anything beyond himself. Valentina changes that equation. Once Frank cares about someone, he becomes more vulnerable. But he also becomes more motivated. That is the paradox the movie wants us to notice. Connection creates risk, but connection also creates meaning. When the explosive bracelet threat is finally resolved, the significance goes beyond simply removing a physical device. The bracelet represented a form of control that Frank could not solve through ordinary competence. Its removal therefore marks the restoration of agency. But the deeper victory is not that Frank can once again move without restriction. It is that he now has a reason to choose movement differently. At the beginning, freedom meant keeping everyone at a distance. By the end, freedom begins to mean choosing who is worth staying close to. That is why the emotional resolution with Valentina matters even if the romance itself is not the strongest part of the screenplay. The film is not asking Frank to become a romantic hero. It is asking him to become a man capable of acknowledging that another person matters. Frank Martin's psychology becomes clearer when we stop treating his rules as cool catchphrases and start treating them as coping mechanisms. Rules reduce uncertainty. They tell him what is acceptable and what is not. They protect him from negotiation. They protect him from emotional responsibility. Never change the deal means the terms remain stable. No names means identity remains irrelevant. Never open the package means curiosity cannot create obligation. Taken together, the rules create a professional environment where Frank does not need to know anyone deeply. The less he knows, the less he can be emotionally responsible for. The rules are therefore not only about professionalism. They are about distance. They give him a structure in which detachment can be mistaken for freedom. That is why Valentina becomes psychologically important. She makes the rules harder to maintain because she is constantly transforming herself from object into person. She has a personality. She has desires. She has fears. She makes choices. She is not content to sit silently and be delivered. The more Frank learns about her, the less plausible his emotional detachment becomes. Her very existence challenges the third rule. You are not supposed to open the package, but what happens when the package talks to you? What happens when she makes you laugh? What happens when she becomes frightened? What happens when you begin worrying about her? The rule cannot answer those questions because the rule was designed to prevent them from existing. Frank's body also tells this story. Statham's performance relies on restraint. The character rarely needs exaggerated facial expressions because his physical stillness already communicates control. He stands upright. He moves economically. He looks before acting. Even when surrounded by chaos, he often appears as though he is waiting for the environment to reveal its weakness. This creates a powerful visual contrast during action scenes. Everyone else is moving wildly while Frank remains centered. He becomes the calm point inside the storm. But Transporter 3 gradually destabilizes that image. The chaos begins to matter to him emotionally. It is no longer simply a problem to solve. Valentina's safety matters. The environmental consequences matter. The criminal's manipulation matters. His stillness remains, but its meaning changes. It stops looking like emotional emptiness and begins to look like emotional discipline. His relationship with violence is similarly revealing. Frank is extremely capable of violence, but he generally does not appear to enjoy it. His fights are solutions. This distinction separates him from the villain. Johnson uses violence as an extension of domination. Frank uses it as a tool for ending threats. The difference is not that one man is violent and the other is not. Both are willing to cause harm. The difference is what violence means to them. Frank does not seek power over people as an identity. He seeks control over situations. That makes him a more complicated action hero than a simple killing machine. He has boundaries. He may break rules, but he does not abandon all moral structure. In fact, the entire story can be understood as Frank discovering which boundaries are worth keeping. Johnson, meanwhile, has no meaningful interest in those distinctions. People are useful or useless. Cargo has value or does not. Fear is a tool. Surveillance is a tool. Money is a tool. Institutions are tools. His criminal operation depends on reducing complicated human and environmental consequences into manageable transactions. This is why the environmental element matters. Pollution is invisible at the moment it is created. The person responsible can be far away from the damage. Johnson's system thrives on that distance. Frank's world is the opposite. He is physically present. He is the one driving. He is the one being attacked. He is the one sitting beside Valentina. He cannot maintain the illusion that consequences belong to someone else. The supporting cast reinforces this philosophical division. Valentina wants to know the person behind the profession. Tarconi already knows some of that person. Johnson wants only to manipulate the professional. The henchmen want to defeat the body. Each relationship pulls Frank in a different direction. That makes Valentina more significant than a conventional action movie love interest. She is not simply there to provide romance. She represents the possibility that Frank's life could contain something other than work. She introduces uncertainty, but she also introduces emotional purpose. This brings us back to the film's central theme: control versus freedom. Frank's entire life is built around the belief that control produces freedom. If he controls his emotions, his schedule, his contracts, his possessions, and his relationships, nobody can control him. But the film demonstrates the weakness in that philosophy. Total control is impossible. Something will always happen that cannot be predicted. A criminal can attach a bomb. A passenger can become important. A contract can become morally compromised. A road can disappear. A vehicle can be damaged. A person can change. The attempt to eliminate uncertainty can therefore become another form of imprisonment. The bracelet is the most obvious symbol of this idea because it literalizes the boundary. Frank is given a specific radius. Cross it and he dies. It is a simple rule, but its simplicity is precisely what makes it powerful. Frank's normal rules are also simple. They allow him to navigate a complicated world without emotional ambiguity. The bracelet simply externalizes the logic. It says, stay within the boundary and survive. Leave it and suffer the consequence. The film's emotional argument eventually becomes almost the opposite. Sometimes staying inside the boundary is the thing that prevents you from living. The Audi becomes another symbol. It represents precision, speed, independence, and technical mastery. Frank's relationship with the car is almost intimate because it reflects his own personality. It is sleek rather than flashy. Powerful rather than chaotic. Functional rather than sentimental. When Frank drives, he is at his most comfortable. The road gives him a language he understands. Yet the movie constantly places that symbol of freedom under restriction. The car can go fast, but it cannot escape the bracelet's boundary. Frank can move, but only according to someone else's rules. The irony is almost elegant. The transporter has become a prisoner inside his own vehicle. The black suit works similarly. It is visual shorthand for professionalism. Frank enters almost any environment looking prepared. The suit creates a silhouette that makes him instantly recognizable. But it also functions like armor. It helps him become the role. As long as he is the transporter, he does not have to be Frank. He can be efficient. He can be anonymous. He can complete the job. Valentina's presence keeps making the distinction harder. She interacts with the person rather than the role. The suit remains, but the identity inside it becomes more complicated. The film also uses space to reinforce these ideas. Open landscapes suggest freedom, yet Frank remains constrained. Enclosed industrial areas suggest control and exploitation. Vehicles create temporary shelters that can also become traps. Windows and mirrors separate people while allowing them to see one another. Containers hold cargo, turning people into objects. Roads connect locations while also dictating direction. The movie is full of things that move and things that contain. That visual pattern supports the larger idea that freedom is not simply about having physical space. You can have an open road and still be trapped. The deeper meaning becomes even more interesting when transportation is connected to globalization. The story involves goods crossing borders, criminal networks exploiting systems, and dangerous material being moved for profit. Transportation is the mechanism that allows the modern world to function, but the same mechanisms can also hide exploitation. Goods travel farther than the people who consume them. Waste can be moved away from the people who created it. Responsibility can be distributed across enough intermediaries that nobody feels personally accountable. Johnson's operation depends on exactly this kind of fragmentation. The people who make decisions can remain distant from the consequences. Frank's transformation therefore becomes a moral rejection of pure transactional thinking. A person cannot always be treated like cargo. A job cannot always be treated as morally neutral. Following a rule does not automatically make an action right. Sometimes responsibility begins precisely where professional neutrality ends. Frank does not become heroic because he suddenly develops a speech about justice. He becomes more human because he allows himself to make a choice based on care rather than contract. That idea also explains why the action choreography can be read as character development. Frank's fights are improvisational because his identity is built around solving problems. Early in the film, improvisation serves survival. Later, it serves protection. The physical technique remains similar, but the purpose changes. This is an important distinction because good action filmmaking often communicates character through movement rather than dialogue. A reckless hero fights differently from a disciplined hero. A frightened hero fights differently from an arrogant hero. Frank fights like a man who believes every problem has a solution if he can remain calm long enough to find it. His body becomes a visual representation of his mind. The production itself is deeply tied to the action aesthetics of the late 2000s. This was a period when international action films could be fast, glossy, physically aggressive, and relatively straightforward in their storytelling. The transporter movies were part of a European-produced action tradition that could move between countries, languages, locations, and audiences without requiring an enormous mythology. The formula was accessible. Jason Statham was the recognizable center. The car was another recognizable center. The mission supplied the structure. The fights supplied the spectacle. The result could travel easily because physical action requires less cultural translation than dialogue-heavy drama. Olivier Megaton's direction emphasizes momentum. The film wants the viewer to feel movement constantly. Cars accelerate. People chase. Frank fights. Locations change. Information arrives. The editing keeps the energy high. Sometimes that kinetic style is effective because it mirrors Frank's environment. Sometimes it becomes excessive because speed is not the same thing as clarity. Rapid cutting can make an action sequence feel intense, but it can also make geography harder to understand. This is one of the film's recurring trade-offs. The filmmakers want spectacle and velocity, and sometimes the pursuit of velocity overwhelms spatial precision. Yet there is an interesting contradiction between the direction and the protagonist. The movie itself is often chaotic, but Frank is not. He becomes the calm center around which the camera can create chaos. That contrast is one of the reasons Statham works so well in the role. He does not need to compete with the editing. His performance provides an anchor. When the camera cuts rapidly between vehicles and obstacles, Frank's expression often remains controlled. That makes him appear almost superhuman. It also contributes to the film's exaggerated action logic. We are not necessarily watching a realistic person. We are watching the idealized fantasy of competence. This is where the film's practical-looking action becomes especially important. Vehicle choreography, stunt work, physical combat, crashes, and environmental interaction give the movie a tactile quality. Even when the physics are pushed beyond reality, the audience can feel the weight of the objects. The Audi has mass. The punches have impact. Tires grip and slide. Metal bends. Glass breaks. Bodies collide. These details create a physical world in which Frank's competence feels embodied rather than purely digital. The late 2000s action landscape was already moving toward increasingly elaborate visual effects, but films like Transporter 3 still relied heavily on the appeal of physical stunt spectacle. The bicycle sequence captures that philosophy perfectly. On paper, it is ridiculous. In execution, it is memorable because the choreography understands the basic transporter principle. Give Frank a physical limitation and watch him turn it into an advantage. The environment becomes an extension of his intelligence. He does not simply overpower his opponents. He uses timing, momentum, and objects around him. That makes the action feel like problem solving. The same principle applies to the fights. Frank often wins because he understands the space faster than his opponents do. Sound completes this physical illusion. Engines are not background noise in Transporter 3. They are character language. The roar of acceleration tells us Frank is moving from calculation into action. Tire noise communicates speed. Gear changes provide rhythm. Impacts are deliberately heightened. Punches sound heavier than ordinary punches. Metal collides with metal. Explosions arrive with low-frequency force. The bracelet itself becomes a source of psychological tension because its presence can be felt even when it is not being used. Sound reminds the audience that the threat is attached to Frank's body. The contrast between loud and quiet moments is equally important. Action movies often rely on constant volume, but the quieter scenes give the audience a chance to feel the emotional difference between Frank and Valentina. When the soundscape becomes less aggressive, the characters become more exposed. Without engines and impacts to fill the space, silence becomes revealing. Frank's emotional reserve is more noticeable. Valentina's directness becomes more important. The absence of noise creates room for personality. The score functions as an accelerator. Rhythmic electronic elements fit the late 2000s action identity and help bridge the gap between story beats and spectacle. The music does not necessarily need to provide a complex emotional theme because the film's primary objective is momentum. It tells the audience when danger is approaching, when a chase is accelerating, and when a fight is becoming more intense. That repetition can sometimes feel formulaic, but it also contributes to the movie's identity. The sound and editing work together to create a continuous feeling of forward motion. This is important because the screenplay itself is relatively simple. When the narrative is straightforward, audiovisual energy has to carry some of the burden. The movie does not have an enormous mystery to unfold. Its conspiracy is functional. Its villains are recognizable. Its objective is easy to understand. The complexity comes from how the journey is staged and how Frank's emotional relationship to the mission changes. Music, sound, editing, cars, and fights keep the experience active while the character arc develops underneath. When Transporter 3 was released, that simplicity produced a divided reaction. Critics could reasonably point toward predictable plotting, thin villain characterization, exaggerated physics, uneven romance, and repetitive action structure. Those criticisms are not difficult to understand. The movie is not a subtle crime drama. Johnson is more of a functional thematic villain than a psychologically unforgettable one. The environmental conspiracy has larger implications than the screenplay fully explores. Frank's survival abilities can become so extreme that suspense occasionally weakens. And the relationship with Valentina is not always paced with the naturalism of a serious romantic drama. But audiences were not necessarily watching for the same thing. Jason Statham had become one of the defining physical action stars of the period. His appeal was based partly on reliability. When audiences bought a Transporter movie, they knew what Frank Martin was going to deliver. He would fight. He would drive. He would improvise. He would remain cool under pressure. The movie's simplicity was therefore part of its accessibility. You did not need extensive franchise knowledge. You did not need to remember a complicated mythology. You needed to understand that Frank had a job, someone had trapped him, and now he had to survive. That distinction between critical sophistication and genre effectiveness is important. A movie can be formulaic and still work. Formula is not automatically a flaw. In action cinema, formula can provide a rhythm that audiences enjoy. The question is whether the movie adds enough personality to make the formula worth revisiting. Transporter 3 has Jason Statham. It has Frank Martin. It has the Audi. It has the black suit. It has the road. It has a recognizable physical language. Those elements can carry a surprising amount of entertainment value. The romance remains the biggest gamble because it challenges audience expectations. Some viewers enjoy Valentina because she gives Frank a personality contrast he needs. Others find the relationship distracting because the action franchise is more comfortable when Frank is alone. Both responses are understandable. Valentina changes the movie. The question is whether that change feels like evolution or interruption. From a thematic perspective, it is evolution. From a pacing perspective, it can occasionally feel like interruption. The contradiction is part of what makes the third movie distinct within the trilogy. The film's commercial logic also becomes clearer in this context. Action is a globally marketable language. A car chase needs little explanation. A fistfight needs little translation. A recognizable star can carry a poster. The Transporter name establishes expectations. The Audi establishes visual identity. The black suit establishes character. This combination reduces marketing risk. The movie does not have to sell an elaborate new universe. It only has to promise another Frank Martin adventure. Jason Statham's growing star power was therefore central to the franchise's business identity. Frank Martin was not simply a character played by Statham. The character increasingly became part of the Statham brand itself. His physical presence became a selling point. His ability to play hyper-competent professionals would later become one of the most recognizable elements of his filmography. Characters such as Chev Kelios, Arthur Bishop, and Lee Christmas belong to different franchises and have different personalities, but they share an underlying fantasy: the man who enters chaos and remains competent. Frank is one of the early and clearest versions of that fantasy. He does not need to explain why he is good at what he does. The mystery is part of the attraction. Over-explaining him would weaken him. His history matters less than his behavior. He is a professional because the movie needs him to be. The audience learns who he is through his rules, his actions, and the small moments where those rules break down. That is also why the original Transporter trilogy remains culturally recognizable even though the individual films are not generally treated as landmark cinema. They belong to a specific era of action filmmaking. The late 2000s had a tactile, glossy, aggressive style that now feels increasingly nostalgic. There is something distinctive about the combination of European locations, black suits, luxury cars, electronic music, practical-looking stunts, and physically imposing stars. It belongs to the period before superhero cinema became the dominant mainstream action language. These films did not need universes. They needed a protagonist and a problem. Transporter 3 therefore occupies an interesting historical position. It did not revolutionize action filmmaking. It did not redefine the genre. But it consolidated a style. It showed the commercial strength of the international action star. It reinforced the professional with rules archetype. It demonstrated how a simple premise could travel across markets. It helped cement Frank Martin as one of Statham's defining early roles. Its influence is less about direct imitation and more about normalization. Audiences became comfortable with the idea of a Statham movie as a particular type of experience. A man with exceptional physical competence enters a dangerous situation, refuses to panic, and turns the environment into an advantage. That expectation would become increasingly valuable throughout Statham's career. At the same time, Transporter 3 exposes the limits of the formula. A professional with rules can be compelling, but eventually the rules need to be challenged. A car chase can be spectacular, but eventually the audience needs a reason to care about where the car is going. A villain can be threatening, but eventually control must become personal. The third movie tries to solve those problems by adding Valentina and the environmental conspiracy. The results are mixed, but the attempt is significant. The film's criticisms become easiest to understand when separated into categories. Some are genuine screenplay weaknesses. The conspiracy is not especially subtle. Johnson can feel more functional than memorable. The romance develops rapidly. Certain sequences rely on convenience. Other criticisms are genre conventions. Frank's near-superhuman abilities are part of the fantasy. The explosive bracelet operates according to heightened action logic. The movie is not trying to simulate an ordinary person's survival chances. And some elements are intentional exaggeration. The absurdity of the action is part of the Transporter identity. The question is therefore not whether the film is realistic. It is whether its internal fantasy is entertaining and coherent. For long stretches, it is. Frank's competence gives the action a clear personality. The Audi provides a physical identity. The bracelet creates a simple but effective limitation. Valentina adds emotional unpredictability. The road structure provides constant movement. The result is not sophisticated in every area, but it knows what kind of movie it is. The biggest structural problem is repetition. Once the audience understands that Frank is nearly impossible to defeat physically, repeated pursuit sequences lose some suspense. The movie must therefore rely on escalation. Bigger threats. More complicated geography. More difficult restrictions. More personal stakes. When escalation works, the film feels energetic. When it does not, the audience can see the formula underneath the spectacle. Rapid editing contributes to this issue. Fast cuts can make a sequence feel dangerous, but if the audience cannot clearly understand the physical relationship between vehicles, characters, and obstacles, intensity can replace suspense. Good action requires both speed and geography. Transporter 3 sometimes prioritizes the former. Yet the film still contains enough readable physical ideas to remain memorable. Frank uses a vehicle. Frank uses an object. Frank changes direction. Frank turns an opponent's momentum against them. Those basic actions give the chaos structure. The romance has a similar problem. Valentina's presence is conceptually important, but the screenplay occasionally asks the audience to accept emotional developments faster than the character work completely supports. Still, the relationship succeeds at the level of theme. Frank needs someone who challenges his system. Valentina does exactly that. She is not dangerous because she can defeat him physically. She is dangerous because she can make him care. And caring is the one vulnerability Frank cannot punch his way out of. That is why the final movement of the story matters. Frank's victory is not simply about defeating individual opponents. It is about rejecting the idea that his life can be reduced to contracts and boundaries. He has to choose what matters. He has to accept that protecting someone can be more important than completing a transaction. He has to recognize that freedom is not the same thing as isolation. The irony is that Frank spends the entire movie trying to regain control, but the path toward freedom requires him to give some control away. He must allow Valentina to influence him. He must trust another person. He must accept uncertainty. He must accept that caring about someone creates the possibility of loss. In other words, he must accept vulnerability. This is where the three rules take on their final meaning. Never change the deal. No names. Never open the package. Each rule begins as a practical professional principle, but each also protects Frank from emotional exposure. The first prevents negotiation. The second prevents intimacy. The third prevents curiosity. The film gradually attacks all three protections. The deal changes because Frank's priorities change. The name matters because the person matters. The package is opened because the person inside it can no longer be treated as an object. That is the deeper transformation. Frank does not abandon discipline. He does not stop being professional. He does not become reckless. He learns that rules are tools, not identities. There is a difference between following a rule because it helps you live and following it because you are afraid to make a choice. Johnson never understands that difference. His system depends on people remaining objects. Frank ultimately defeats him because he refuses that logic. He chooses responsibility. He chooses Valentina. He chooses to interfere. He chooses to care. That is also why the environmental subplot fits the larger theme. Johnson's operation treats the world itself as an object. Land can be contaminated. People can be moved. Information can be manipulated. Everything has a price. Frank's transformation is a rejection of that transactional worldview.